There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a library late in the evening, the kind where you can almost hear the dust resting on old shelves. That is the feeling we're going for tonight. Not excitement, not drama. Just a long, slow, unhurried walk through some of the most unremarkable corners of American history. The parts that never made it into textbooks, the parts that did not need to. Pull your blanket up a little higher, there is nowhere to be. Let us start somewhere very small. The town of Millbury, Massachusetts, sometime in the 1840s. There was a committee formed there, a standing committee, whose sole purpose was to decide what kind of gravel should be used on the roads leading into the town centre. Not whether to gravel the roads. That had already been decided, just the type of gravel. The committee met, by all surviving accounts, approximately 11 times over the course of 2 years. They took careful notes. The notes still exist in a county archive. They are about gravel. Page after page, careful handwriting, talking about gravel. The road, by the way, was eventually gravelled. It held up reasonably well for several decades before being paved over entirely. In 1887, the United States Post Office received a very polite letter from a man in rural Indiana who wanted to know the official policy on mailing a moderately sized tortoise. He was not trying to cause trouble. He just had a tortoise and a relative in Ohio who wanted one, and he thought mailing might be simpler than travelling. The post office responded after some weeks. The answer, delivered with all the gravity of federal correspondence, was that live animals could not be mailed under current regulations, but that the man should feel free to write back if his situation changed. The man apparently did not write back. What happened to the tortoise is not recorded. There was a lighthouse keeper named Ezra Whitmore who worked a posting on the Lake Erie shoreline in the 1870s. His logbooks, which covered roughly 16 years of service, have been preserved and reviewed by at least 2 historians who have written about them. Both historians noted, with something between admiration and gentle bafflement, that Whitmore logged the weather every single morning without fail. Rain, clear, partly cloudy, fog, occasional wind from the northwest. Day after day, year after year, in the same careful handwriting that barely changed across 16 volumes. He also logged his meals when they were particularly notable. On December the 14th, 1874, he noted that he had made a very good bean soup. He described it as satisfactory. He did not elaborate further. The next entry was about fog. Around the turn of the 20th century, the city of Cincinnati undertook a fairly ambitious project to extend a subway line beneath the streets of the downtown area. Money was raised, plans were drawn, tunnels were dug, concrete was poured, and then, gradually, the money ran out, and the project slowed, and eventually stopped. The tunnels were not filled in, they were just left there, running quietly beneath the city, unused. For decades. The city has periodically looked into finishing the system, or converting it to something else, or doing something with the tunnels. Various committees have met, various reports have been filed. The tunnels, as of relatively recent years, are still mostly there. They are occasionally toured. People walk through them in organised groups and look at the concrete walls and the stopped construction and the darkness, and then they walk back out into the sunlight and go about their days. Somewhere in the Federal Archives in Washington, there is a report from the early 1900s regarding the standardization of the size of envelopes used in government correspondence. The report runs to something like 40 pages. It includes measurements. It includes diagrams. It includes a thoughtful discussion of the relative merits of different envelope sealing methods and the impact of humidity on paper stock in various climates. At the end of the report, a recommendation was made. The recommendation was accepted. Envelopes of a standard size were thereafter used in government correspondence. The process took roughly 3 years from initial inquiry to final implementation. The envelopes were fine. There was a small agricultural college in the Midwest in the 1890s that kept meticulous records of its experimental farm. They grew things. They measured things. They wrote down what they grew and what they measured. The records are quite thorough. One particular notebook covers an entire growing season devoted largely to trying different planting depths for winter wheat. The researcher who kept the notebook had very neat handwriting and a fondness for recording the temperature at the exact moment he took his measurements. The results of the experiment were, by the notebook's own somewhat understated conclusion, mixed. Some depths worked better than others. Further research was suggested. Whether further research was conducted is not clearly established by the surviving records. If you have ever driven through the Great Plains on a long, flat stretch of highway, you may have noticed the grain elevators. They rise up out of the flatness like tall, pale monuments to the ordinary. They have been there a long time. The earliest ones were built in the mid-1800s, and the process of their construction was, by accounts of the time, not particularly dramatic. Men came, lumber was hauled in, foundations were laid, walls went up. The elevators were filled with grain in the autumn and emptied again in the winter, and filled again the following autumn. This went on for generations. The men who built them had names that were recorded in county deed books and not much else. They did the work, and the work was done, and that was more or less the extent of it. In 1903, the city of Portland, Oregon, commissioned a survey of its public park benches. Someone was sent around to all the parks to look at all the benches and write down their condition. Some were good, some needed paint, a few needed new boards. The survey took several weeks and produced a document of moderate length. Repairs were subsequently made to the benches that needed them. The parks remained open throughout. People sat on the benches before the repairs, during the repairs when benches were available, and after the repairs. The benches held up for a number of years before requiring attention again. There was a ferry that ran across a particular stretch of the Ohio River for most of the second half of the 1800s. It was a small ferry. It carried people across in the mornings and back in the evenings, mostly workers and farmers and the occasional traveller. The ferryman who ran it for the longest stretch of that period was a man whose name appears in county records as simply J. Harlan. He kept a basic log of crossings, how many passengers, whether the river was running high or low, whether there was ice to contend with in winter. The log is not exciting to read. It is the kind of document that communicates more than anything else the persistence of ordinary life. The way people needed to get from one side of a river to the other, day after day, and someone was there to take them, day after day, for years on end, through weather and seasons and the slow turning of decades. There is a particular kind of handwriting you find in old municipal records that has its own specific quality to it. Careful, unhurried. The letters formed with a kind of attention that suggests someone sitting at a desk for a long time, ink flowing at a steady pace, recording things that mattered to them in the moment and perhaps to no one very much afterward. Tax assessments, property transfers, lists of registered voters in small precincts, minutes of town meetings at which it was agreed, after some discussion, that the fence along the east side of the public common should be repaired before winter. These documents exist in their thousands across the archives of American counties and townships. Most of them have never been read twice. In the summer of 1878, a small delegation from a county agricultural society in central Pennsylvania travelled by train to Philadelphia to attend an exposition. They spent 3 days there. They looked at farm equipment. They ate meals at a boarding house near the exposition grounds. They returned home and wrote a brief report for the Society's quarterly newsletter describing what they had seen. The farm equipment, they concluded, represented some promising developments. They returned to their farms. The fall harvest came. The delegation members are remembered, to the extent they are remembered at all, as names in the membership rolls of a county agricultural society in central Pennsylvania, which still exists in some form in the county historical archives. Deep in the records of the United States Geological Survey from the early 1900s, there are field notebooks from surveyors who spent months walking through remote stretches of the West, taking measurements of elevation and terrain and water flow. The notebooks are mostly numbers, columns of numbers, sometimes a brief notation about the weather or the condition of the trail or the distance to the nearest camp. Every once in a while a surveyor would note something a little more personal, that the mosquitoes were very bad that week, or that a mule had been uncooperative, or that the view from a certain ridge was, in the surveyor's estimation, quite fine. These small human interruptions in the columns of numbers are oddly touching. The people doing the work had lives, feelings, opinions about mules. The numbers don't capture that, the notebooks just barely do. There was a clock tower built in a small Ohio town in 1891. It was built as a gift to the town from a man who had made some money in the dry goods business and wanted to leave something lasting. The clock worked reliably for many years. It required winding at regular intervals, which was the responsibility of a series of town employees whose names are in the payroll records. When the mechanism began to fail in the 1930s, a decision was made, after some town council deliberation, to repair it rather than replace it. The repair took several months. The clock resumed working. It has needed attention a few more times over the years since then. It still stands. People walk past it. Some of them look up. There is something particular about the way time moves when you're reading very old documents about very ordinary things. It slows down. The urgency of the present moment recedes. You're reading about a town committee meeting in 1884 to discuss the maintenance of a drainage ditch, and the concerns of the committee members feel genuinely real to you for a moment. The way they worried about whether the ditch was deep enough, whether it would flood in spring, whether the neighbouring landowner would share the cost of clearing it. These were real concerns to real people in a real place. The ditch has probably been filled in by now. The town has changed. The people at that meeting have been gone for a very long time. But the record of their worry about the drainage ditch sits quietly in a folder in a county archive, waiting for someone to open it and read about their concerns, which were so ordinary and so complete. In the 1850s, there were companies that made and sold wooden boxes. Just wooden boxes. Boxes for shipping things, for storing things, for moving things from one place to another. One such company operated out of a town in upstate New York, and its records, order books, correspondence, accounts payable, survived in a local historical society's collection. Reading through them is a long, slow drift through commerce at its most foundational level. Someone needed 200 small boxes, someone else needed 30 large ones. A letter arrived inquiring about the availability of a particular size. A letter went back explaining that the size could be made to order at a reasonable price. Boxes were made, boxes were shipped. The world moved things from one place to another, and these boxes helped it do that, and the company that made them kept careful records, and those records still exist. It is late now, or it should be, if you are listening to this the way it was meant to be heard. Horizontal, in the dark, with the room gone quiet around you. There is nothing left to do tonight. The committees have adjourned. The ferries have made their last crossing. The lighthouse keeper has logged the weather and the fog and the satisfactory bean soup and has closed his notebook until morning. Somewhere in a county archive, a document about a drainage ditch or a gravel road, or the proper size of a government envelope is resting in its folder, undisturbed, just existing the way things that have outlasted their usefulness tend to exist, quietly, without complaint, in no particular hurry. The clock tower in Ohio is ticking. The subway tunnels in Cincinnati are dark and still and cool. The tortoise in Indiana arrived safely or didn't, and either way that was a long time ago. Let everything settle now. There is nothing more to know tonight, just the soft weight of ordinary history keeping you company on your way to sleep.